Thanks for the opportunity to be here, and especially for it to be during Anti-Poverty Week, and I want to say a bit about that in a moment. But perhaps to emphasise that I don't really approach this topic mainly as an academic in the area, because I'm not. I've been mainly for the last 15 or 20 years only part-time as a professor, but more an advocate or a coordinator of cross-sectoral groups in the community pushing for reform in housing change. So I'm drawing a fair bit on the sort of practical experience, either when I was the head of a welfare rights centre right at the coalface, or working closely with those people. But it is an Anti-Poverty Week, so I hope you'll excuse me if I just say a little bit about that, because we established that 15 odd years ago at the University of New South Wales, at the Social Justice Project that I'm the head of. And it really arose from my experience. I just finished then as the head of the International Council on Social Welfare and was aware of some of the activities developing around the International Anti-Poverty Day, which is October 17. And although I'm not over the moon about days and things of that kind, they can be more tokenistic than anything else. It seemed to me that there was value in developing it, and particularly to try and get beyond the charmed circle of the usual suspects of people who speak about poverty issues. My own view, and I think the experience of Anti-Poverty Week confirms this, is that there are more people than the media and than many in politics believe in Australia who are deeply concerned about poverty, especially from their own personal experience of people around them, not necessarily themselves being in poverty, but people who move in those communities where people who are severely disadvantaged are, at least to some extent, still visible. But it's important not to preach to them, not to tell them what they should think about poverty too much, and certainly not what should be done about it, and to encourage them to feel part of a broader movement to try and reduce poverty without having to sign up to any particular ideological framework. And also not to exaggerate to them the nature of the hardship that we have. And so Anti-Poverty Week itself has remained fiercely rather like just hiring a hall and saying anyone can come and turn up their stall. And one of my roles as the national chair, which I've been from the beginning, is actually to stop it, as it were, being taken over by any particular policy or approach. It's got to be a broad church. That's sometimes misunderstood by some, but of course, while participating in Anti-Poverty Week, one can say whatever one likes. One can push as much of a policy line as one wants. But it's important that the week itself, as a process, as a week, is available to everyone. And we've grown from the first year, when we had 5 activities, all run by people whose arms had been severely bent by me, to the last 4 years we've had more than 450 around Australia, and I think we'll have the same number this year. And just to give you an indication of the breadth of it, read from the National Media Alert we put out at the end of last week about their types of activities: launches, forums, workshops, awards, exhibitions, walks, fundraisers, publications, presentation addresses, festivals, a huge festival in Forest Place in Perth this year, as it was last year. And the venues include shopping centres, parks, cathedrals, community centres, libraries, hotels, health centres, welfare agencies, business offices, town halls, parliaments, universities, schools, car parks, squares and markets. And we've had some even more out there, alternative venues in previous years. You may have seen there have been some reports or strategies already released, and one of them is particularly relevant here is Anglicare's State of the Family report, which they release each year during Anti-Poverty Week. This year we've also got a Salvation Army report and a report on poverty and disadvantage from the Curtin Economics Centre in Western Australia, and many others. So I hope, if you haven't already been involved with Anti-Poverty Week, that you might take the opportunity in the future. I should say it's spread now to Scotland first, about 2 or 3 years ago, and it's now spread to the United States. Anyway, that's a digression, but I hope a legitimate one, to try to emphasise the importance of Anti-Poverty Week, since we're meeting during that week. Now, I want to turn now to the main theme, which is housing, transport and family problems, whether poverty or hardship or of other kinds. And in doing that, I want to look at aspects of the impact of the family home, so that's cost and adequacy and security, and of the family location, the choice they may have about location, problems relating to family relationships and health, and some broader public impacts. And then I'll look at some options for action. Deliberately, some of them not in the mainstream of what many people who are working specifically on family issues focus on. I firmly believe that those of us who are concerned about social justice, many of us anyway, not everyone, but many of us need to address ourselves to the deeper underlying causes very often, particularly in relation to economic issues, not to regard economic issues as either beyond us or beneath us, because very often otherwise, frankly, we're just sort of trying to swim upstream, trying to reduce some of the damage of the deeper underlying environments and economic settings and public policy settings that are causing the problems. So I'm going to look at tax reform in relation to the principal residences. I deliberately don't call it the family home because increasingly things that are called the family home are really tax shelters, and it's being a little too kind to them to call them family homes. So it's principal residences, secondly rental properties, and thirdly some issues to do with transport. And then at public planning and investment, regional cities, housing and transport. Some underlying concerns before doing that, just very briefly. Firstly, to an extent that I think few people in Australia realise or are willing to admit, we're a highly vulnerable economy. When it happens, people are going to say no one believed it was going to happen. I don't really understand why. We've been saved for a decade or so by China, but the underlying problems with our economy will come out eventually. One can't say exactly when, but I'm sure they will. We're a very small economy. We're very remote, both in distance and in some ways in culture, from the countries that are near us, and we're very heavily dependent on commodities. And increasingly, the extent to which we are able to make a living in the world, as it were, through services, we will be subject to much more competition from Asia. We have very low levels of public investment, even though we're a country which is one of the fastest growing in population in the developed world. We're still a relatively new country in terms of so-called Western development, and we have big distances. You'd expect us to have an above average level of public infrastructure investment amongst developed countries. In fact, it's very low. We have weakening work opportunities, hidden to some extent by the extent to which it's underemployment rather than total unemployment. But the total supply, just in terms of supply, let alone quality, which I'll come to in a moment, of employment is weakening. We have, as I think both ACOS and Anglicare have shown this week, increasing financial inequality. But I want to emphasise many of the studies tend to focus on income inequality, and that's significant, but asset inequality is far worse. It's by a factor of 5 to 10 times worse, the inequality in relation to assets, and getting worse with every passing month. And I think asset inequality is hugely overlooked both within the social justice sector, if I can put it that way, and also more broadly. We have heightened social tensions, I believe, partly religiously related, partly to do with this growing inequality and divide that I'll say a bit more about lately. And I'm afraid I think also we will have heightened race-based social tensions in the future. I think we have to be brutally realistic about that. We have accelerating climate change in a country that's particularly vulnerable to it because of our underlying climate anyway, but secondly, amongst many factors, our dependency on coal. We have a highly concentrated population, and I'll come back to that later. And I think we suffer from particularly poorly informed public discussion by comparison with many other developed countries, partly because of the tendency for the media to become increasingly sensationalist, increasingly pushing material out in haste without having thought about it or checked it sufficiently, and also a growing tendency towards polarisation, especially in the mainstream media, as they seek to find fellow travelling markets in order to try and remain commercially viable. So those are some of the underlying concerns, but I want to move on now to problems relating to the family home. I'm not going to dwell on some of them because I think they're very well known, but prices and rents are much higher relative to incomes than in the past, and extraordinarily high even by international standards, and that's comparing it to household income. And when you bear in mind that household income for the relatively middle to higher is two-earner income, where a few decades ago it was only one-earner income, it shows you that this has gone up by far more than just real terms, because household disposable income has gone up a lot ahead of inflation over that longer period, as women in particular have come into the paid workforce. And that means, of course, that sole parents and other single income families are particularly falling behind. These prices and rents may plateau, and I'm afraid the media will then believe the problem is gone. They may even fall slightly, and again the media would be, and others would be very ill-advised, I think, to think that the problem is gone, but I'm afraid that's the way things often operate. We are already, and have been for a long time, at deeply damaging levels of house prices and rents, damaging not only for the people who have to pay them, but also for the broader economic development of the country, which I'll come to later. And of course it's aggravated by the fact that public housing is not keeping pace with increases in the size of the population, let alone increases in the populations that formerly would have been able to get into it and needed it. We've got increasing dependence on parental support in order to get into the housing market. Now that may to some extent, funnily enough, overcome some of the massive problems of intergenerational inequity that are arising from the sort of baby boomy generation, in a sense. At least some of their ill-gotten gains are being passed on to help their children in this way. But that's fine for those who've got parents who've got lucky, or wise, but in many cases it's really luck, and have that gain to pass on. So it's actually aggravating very severely inherited inequity, which is one of the worst forms of inequity, and I think it's a huge social problem, and some of us have been pointing that out vainly for 20 years, because none of this is really new. It's just become even more acute, but it's been a major problem and clearly was going to become worse from 20 years ago. There's greater difficulty in meeting other basic costs, of course. Housing is the largest expenditure for most families, and it's the first in a sense. It's the one that they really have to pay, and they'll go without almost everything else, including food, in order to keep the home over their heads. And therefore it has flow-on impacts to food, to clothing, to school trips, to health costs. I saw Andrew Lee, the MP, who wrote a really wonderful speech for Anglicare Australia National Conference recently, who says, and I'm sure he's right because he's so meticulous, that lower income people have 7 less teeth than higher income people, just because of the disparities in the ability to have dental care. So these are sort of deeply brutal everyday life problems that are caused by the higher housing costs. But also, I think for the first time really, at least in my experience, it's now reasonable to say that much of the cause of homelessness is housing costs. I don't think that was the case 10 or 20 years ago. There were usually other factors that were far more prominent than the actual cost of housing. But I think now it's fair to say that unaffordability of housing is a really quite substantial and growing factor in the problems of homelessness. We have very high household debt in Australia. I'll come back to that again later. And we're diverting national resources into just bidding up house prices against each other. National resources which could have gone into job-producing enterprises or into enterprises which would reduce our trade deficit. But all they do is pay more and more money for, by and large, a product that isn't much better than when the price was very much lower. I'll move on then to problems of adequacy. We have larger houses for many families, and of course that's one of the things that's commented upon by people who say, well, house prices are going up, but that's because housing is so large and we're over-providing housing. People have excessive housing expectations. I think to the extent that my view is relevant, that is true that quite a lot of housing that's being provided for people now is pretty much over the top. I've been looking at some recently where there's sort of as many as 3 or 4 sort of entertainment theatres or multimedia places of that sort of thing in a fairly standard house. They are getting very big for middle income, But the biggest problem in house prices is not the construction of the house by a long shot, it's the land. And so those who worry about the cost of housing, of building, okay, it may be that some of the houses are a little over the top, but that's not really a significant impact in the broad scheme of things in house prices. It's the land. And one problem that flows from that, of course, is that's why you'll tend to have huge McMansions on tiny blocks. And when you look inside those McMansions, quite often, there'll be hardly any furniture. Furniture isn't a tax break. The house is. You'll find I was telling that story from my experience about furniture to someone the other day, and who works at the front line, and she said that their workers often notice when they go to some of those McMansions that when they turn up, there sort of might be one light on in the house, even though there are lots of people in it. They're having to save on energy costs and that sort of thing. So a huge amount of money gone into the house. It's a tax break. Furniture and use of energy is not. There are more families whose only option is an apartment. I think this is a huge problem. Of course, apartments are very desirable, or at least neutral, for many people, but for many others, I think exactly the opposite. And the data and the research tends to suggest particularly high-rise apartments have major problems, especially for people with youngish children. They can be bad for the family relationships through being on top of each other too much without sufficient space and privacy and access to outside. Adverse impacts on health because of the reduced exercise, and adverse impacts on the ability, for example, to study and further one's education. Now, of course, that's not always the case. Some apartments can be better than some detached or semi-detached houses. But we need to be very careful, I think, of believing that apartments are the answer. And especially you find, as I've seen over the years, repeatedly happens in the housing industry, where they say this is what people want. They only want it because it's all they can afford in many cases. Some do want it. I've lived in apartments during my time, and they've been what I wanted to live in at the time. But, I had the money to be in a reasonable apartment. But it's quite misleading to say that just because people are buying apartments, that's what they want and that's a sufficient response to their concerns. And Melbourne, apart from anything else, is as good a place as any to learn the problems of high-rise apartments for low-income people. I thought that lesson had been learnt, but I'm not too sure it has been in the longer term, at least by people in Treasury. More adult children, as you know, now are staying at home. They're not staying out of love, by and large. They're staying because of their wallet. This, I think, is aggravating problems of friction and lack of privacy in many cases. And also, it may be what some people have commented on as a sort of prolonged adolescence or a slowness in becoming independent. I don't just mean in relation to housing, but in other ways. Again, you could regard this as the baby boomers getting back what they deserve from having children around longer than they want, but that's really not helping either side of the equation. And it's also leading, in many cases, to parents staying in a larger house even after the children have left. Larger house than they need and than they want in many cases, because they can't be sure whether the children will in fact in the current housing market want or need to come back. And as you may know, since I'm in that sort of generation where my children are about that age, it's a very common occurrence for people to come back into their parents' house even if they've left it at the age of 30 or even older because of the current housing environment. And also high, particularly cooling costs for many lower income people through very poor housing design. It astounds me how we've allowed such climatically, I always have a problem between climatic and climactic, but here I mean climatic, for our climate to be building houses without eaves and in other ways so much dependent upon air conditioning is really crazy and has been a major factor in the overinvestment in generating plants and therefore the increase in electricity prices. Well, I'll move on to the last of the areas to do with problems with the family home, and that's security. work incomes now are often less secure. This again is a problem in the work environment which I think is not sufficiently picked up by many economists and others who just tend to look at raw figures and at moments in time figures and don't realise that particularly for younger people now so much work is so precarious. Some younger people are at the stage where they relish that. They see it as freedom and flexibility to be an entrepreneur, etc., etc. I may be wrong, but I think quite a lot of them are going to find life very difficult later on when they want a greater degree of security for one reason or another. But in any event, the 7-Eleven experience is actually pretty widespread for many young people, as you probably know. Highly exploitative employer behaviour, not only in relation to low wages, but also in relation to the risks of any downturn, even the fact that not many people turn up at the beginning of a 4-hour shift, so the person gets told to go home and not paid for the remaining 3 hours of the shift they come in for. That kind of behaviour is not that uncommon as part of the general transfer that's occurred in the last 20 years of the risks of business downturn, even short business downturn, being transferred right at the front end to workers rather than carried by the business itself for a reasonable period. Fewer homes fully or largely paid off. As you know, it's still the case that very often data about housing talks about home ownership and homeowners when some of them are home purchasers. They may have only just started buying. Now, for a long while, perhaps that didn't matter in one sense because they were all going to become full homeowners, or nearly all of them, pretty soon. But now it's very important to distinguish. It's probably 5 or 6 years ago that the tipping point, in a sense, occurred when more than 50% of people in buying their homes were still buying rather than fully owning. Before that, it was a much higher proportion. So many are still paying off, and of course now we have interest-only loans. So many people haven't really even started paying off at all. It's said that superannuation will be part of an answer to this, in that instead of in the past being fully paid off when you go into retirement, you won't be fully paid off, but you'll have super to help pay the mortgage. And there's some truth in that, but superannuation is not entirely risk-free. Again, this is another example of the trend in the last 20 years to transfer risk from public or employer locuses to the worker or the consumer. And superannuation, we haven't fully realised yet, I think, we had a short period in the global financial crisis, that superannuation is not actually a golden egg. In any event, just paying out, seeing whether the superannuation will last through your unknown lifespan is very different from having fully paid off your house. The increasing dependence of low-income families on insecure private rental, I think that's pretty widely known, so I won't dwell on it, but of course it's been exaggerated by the relative decline in the availability of public housing. It's also a consequence to some extent of one of the many ways in which Australia is a real outlier, as it were, in the world in the housing area. I don't know of any area of policy where we're actually so unusual by world standards as housing. And one of the ways in which we're unusual is what to people overseas is a quite freakish level of so-called mum and dad investment in property. Of course, it's no longer mum and dad. No other country is remotely near us in terms of the amount of the rental stock which is owned by non-institutions. And although I'm not usually a huge fan of financial institutions, being able to make lots of money out of doing not very much, we badly need, as a very high priority in the housing area, to get our major financial institutions, including superannuation funds, involved in large-scale provision of housing, especially affordable housing. And one of the things that maybe ironically will do in many cases is actually provide greater security for tenants than if one's at the mercy of a particular individual investor who has their own changing family or other needs and greater economic vulnerability anyway to address. And we also lack long-term residential leases. I chaired, as I think may have been mentioned, a ministerial task force on affordable housing 20 years ago for the New South Wales government, and we pointed out then that we really needed to move as an option to longer term leases, 5 years, 10-year leases, as is common in Europe in particular. There'd have to be some adjustment in landlord-tenant responsibilities. But it's an example of how in many ways we need to provide a richer spectrum rather than two ends of the housing options, rather than the security for life, as it were, of either being in public housing or having paid off your home in home ownership, or totally at the mercy of the private rental market with maybe 2 weeks or 4 weeks security. We need to fill in more of the middle points there, and one of the ways is to have longer term residential leases. Now I'll move on to problems with the family location. A key thing here, I think, is the greater needs and options for job mobility. That, together with the entry of women into the paid workforce, has had very profound impacts on the way in which our urban development occurs and on the needs of families. And I think it's still not fully realised how much of an impact. In a sense, it's both economic regulation and gender deregulation that have worked together to have a huge impact on those patterns. And one of the consequences is that it's made a flexible location, a location from which one will be able to get to any one of a number of possible work opportunities that one may want or need in future years, has become increasingly important. Instead of staying in the same job for 40 years and getting the gold watch, most people in the future, will go through many jobs in that time. When you more or less double that, because you now have in many cases 2 people in that situation in the family, and of course if there are children living at home, adult children living at home, more than that, then you can see why living near, either living near the jobs or living near a very effective transport hub, which will enable you to get in different directions, has become very important. And that's a key factor, the key factor in my view, in the gentrification of the inner city suburbs and increasingly around major transport hubs. So location has become hugely more important in the last 30 years because of those 2 factors. Greater voluntary or involuntary job mobility and at least 2 people now in many households needing to have that mobility, rather than just having the one job for one person. The only work travel need will be to go to the same place for 40 years, which was the norm until moderately recently. So more families living further from work options, and particularly the lower income families, because for the reasons I've mentioned, the people who've got the money move closer to where the jobs or the transport hubs drive up the house prices. Other people have to move out. Now that's been around for a long time, but it's become more acute in the last 10 or 20 years. And amongst other things, that means, of course, if they can afford it, they need more than the one car. Again, I saw an extraordinary study, I hope it wasn't by the Institute of Family Studies, I don't think it was, but which concluded that there wasn't a transport problem, a work travel problem for many people in outer suburbs because they tended to have more cars than people in inner cities, so they could cope with it. Now, that's really confusing cause and effect. They have to have 2 cars in many cases to be able to get to a job, but even actually to get to almost anything else in many of those suburbs. And that's why you do have a relatively high ownership. I know Joe Hockey thought that poor people didn't drive too much. Well, very poor don't, perhaps, but lower income people do, and in some ways they are lower income because they've, in order to get a job, they have to incur those sorts of expenses. Also, more complex transport needs in relation to education, childcare, elder care. This is a huge change again, and again flowing from women's more entry into the paid workforce. The change from the male trip to the place of work for 40 years, with the woman, it was nearly always, though not always, the woman being at home and doing the smaller trips to school, etc., and there being no need for childcare, has transformed, of course, so that nowadays, if you're anything like I was with the 2 location choices I've made in the last 20 years, hugely influenced by access to childcare and to schools, and in one case almost entirely due in those days to the fact that the local primary had an on-site after-school care place. That's really why we chose the suburb where we live. So these are hugely significant to try to, as many of you will know every day, these much more complex transport needs than in the past. And also, of course, more need to, in many cases, travel to help look after parents who are living longer and often in frail conditions. And my generation is starting to experience that very acutely. For many women of roughly my generation, of course, it's meant that they've moved directly into looking after women because it's their parents, because it's tended, unfortunately, to fall on them. And hopefully men will move more into taking a fair share of that at the same time as doing it also into relation to their children. But the transport to look after older people who are often further away because of the problems of housing costs, because it may be that the parents were able to get into a particular suburb when it was relatively modest in price, but children have no chance of getting there. So there can be long distances, as you would know, between, I'll call them the grandparents and the parents. Socioeconomic segregation and disadvantage is getting significantly worse. We've always had it, of course, but by and large, very often it was just between neighbouring suburbs, so that at least you actually saw how the other half lived. Now, for poorer people, that could, have engendered some annoyance, etc. But at least it meant that wealthier people had a little bit better sense of the disadvantage and hardship that others were experiencing. At least it was near them, next suburb, a suburb or two away. Now, if you take particularly Sydney and Melbourne, there are very, very clear dividing lines with huge swathes on one side of the city being advantaged and huge swathes on the other side being disadvantaged. They're really, in many ways, different cities. And I think that has a big impact on social views and values and maybe down the track on social cohesion. And the socioeconomic segregation and disadvantage can, of course, as many studies, including from here, has shown, have very significantly adverse impacts on education, on safety, on behaviour, can even have problems on things like access to transport. I recall there were two public housing estates in southwest Sydney. One had a good shopping centre, a railway station, a good school. Another public housing estate a little bit further out, none of those. Two shops. The only other thing there was a corrective services facility, largely populated by people who lived in the area, unfortunately. And so dangerous that neither buses nor taxis would go into it at any time of day. Now, the area that was sold off by the public housing authorities was the good area because it was more saleable. So we lost a relatively good area. We were left with a place that whoever put it there really should be taken out and severely dealt with. Crazy location and very badly serviced. And finally, in relation to location, we have excessive pressures to live in major cities. I'll come on to that a little bit more later, but it's important to emphasise where we live in Australia is not a neutral choice, sometimes as between metropolitan and elsewhere. Sometimes when I'm talking about this, people will say, oh, you're trying to tell people where to live. We tell them where to live now. We have huge distortions that I'll come to, which greatly influence that choice through distorting economic or social circumstances. It's important, certainly in that context, to bear in mind that although regional housing is by and large cheaper than metro housing, incomes are lower, and so there's actually very little difference between the affordability relative to income as between city and the regions. Now, internet, of course, can be a huge positive here, and that's one of the reasons why the NBN was seen as so significant by Tony Windsor and other people, because the internet and variations of that is so crucial. I recall once when I was up in Lismore in northern New South Wales, and I just looked at the amazingly impressive post office that had been built there more than 100 odd years ago, telephone and post. And you'll see the same with train stations too. The huge amounts of investment that was put into infrastructure for communications. Now, the modern version of that is IT. And we're not spending anything like a commensurate amount on those forms of communications as we did 120 years ago, when it was realised to be so crucial in regional areas. Okay, sorry, I hadn't, also with family location, family relationships and health, adverse impacts of lengthy trips to and from work. I think this is a major problem. Not only the stress of the trip in many cases, for some of course it's actually a peaceful time, and if one's lucky, getting on at the right place and getting off at the right place, and with the right kinds of fellow passengers, it can be a very tranquil or useful experience. For many other people it's not that at all. But of course it's also the extent to which it leads to quite often 3 hours of totally sedentary lifestyle in the train or bus. But then I think particularly importantly the stress back at home, the loss of time from family time caused by work travel, which is now very often up to 60 or 90 minutes or even more. Many people in Sydney, for example, and I think it's the same here at least with say coming from Ballarat, many people in Sydney, even quite well-off people, actually have had to live up on the Central Coast up towards Newcastle or south in Wollongong and have very long commutes each day. So stress back at home, not only in terms of its impact on parenting and what I'm afraid I regard as the myth of quality time. I think there's no substitute if one can have it for a degree of unstructured, relaxed time rather than an alleged 3/4 of an hour quality time which suits the parent but not the child. So there's a big price that we pay in these lengthy travel, but also in the personal relationship if it's a couple as between them. The greater distance from the extended family members who need support, I've referred to that, but also who can provide support. As you know, increasingly now, perhaps to an extent that's excessive, grandparents, certainly many of them think it's excessive, grandparents are helping out with children in order to enable their own children to work. But that's harder if they're living a long way away. And greater difficulty in accessing health and care services. That's pretty obvious, but I'll just point out that greater reliance on market forces, as, for example, you see in childcare, by which I mean the private sector, we seem to be having to learn again what's the relentless lesson of history, which is that those kinds of services will tend to proliferate more in the better income areas. Because obviously people will be able to pay more for their childcare, more chance of being able to make a buck out of the childcare. Okay, and finally on problems with family location, adverse environmental impacts. I won't dwell on that, but it is interesting how some of the urban sprawl, and this applies in Sydney, is occurring in suburbs which were deliberately not developed for quite a long time because of environmental problems. For example, the western suburbs in Sydney, many of the parts towards the Blue Mountains, are particularly subject to air pollution, heat haze related air pollution, that sort of thing. In some other parts, in Perth for example, where there's such a shortage of water, a city really shouldn't be developing as large as Perth is. And so there are environmental impacts of the urban sprawl that's developing, and they're the familiar pollution impacts of car dependency and congestion. We have the adverse pressures on wages and productivity. This is a very important one from the point of view of the future of Australia. For the reasons I mentioned at the outset, we are really going to be facing difficulties in 10, 20, 30 years' time. I can't be sure when, but I'm absolutely sure it will happen. If you want a simple example, which you may laugh at first, but I hope you'll think about it some more, it's useful, I think, often to look at analogies with sport. And 50 years ago, we absolutely dominated the tennis world. We don't now. That's entirely predictable. As more parts of the world became able for socio-economic reasons to engage in the sport, our basic position in terms of our size in the world and other things, and to some extent our remoteness, tends to become more of the reality. And the decline is not a passing thing or a surprising thing. And you'll see it in other areas as well. And the same applies, in my view, to our economy. And that means that we need to avoid any unnecessary impact on our competitiveness. And one of the ways we can do that is by avoiding excessive housing costs. because excessive housing costs tend to flow into higher than would otherwise be the case labour costs, which is a problem for competitiveness. I live near the business development area near Macquarie University in Sydney, and many of the people who work there now have insisted when they've negotiated wages or salaries, if they're in that position, on a premium for the transport problems of getting there, in particular the cost of the tollways to get there. So there's a direct add-on into wages and salaries because of poor transport provision in that situation. It's interesting that Tom Playford, the long-term Premier of South Australia, when he was trying to work out how to make South Australia competitive, and it's a challenge, of course, they've got again now, the main reason why, even now, but more so 10 years ago, South Australia had far more public housing than anywhere else in Australia, is that Playford deliberately provided cheap public housing to attract the car industry and other employers to South Australia, because they would therefore be able to pay lower wages. So their labour costs would be reduced because their workers' housing costs would be lower. And that's the sort of approach we need to take nationally rather than the reverse. Well, I want to move on now to what we do about it, having spent a lot of time on the problems. So firstly, tax reform, the principal residences. It's important, I think, when looking at tax and its impact on housing, to think about three phases of the housing process. Firstly, buying. Secondly, owning. Thirdly, selling. Buying, by and large, is stamp duties. Owning, by and large, is only council rates. And selling, if you live in the home, is nothing, because there's a capital gains tax exemption and a land tax exemption. Our housing system really is upside down and back to front. It's particularly back to front because it hits you at the beginning when you're trying to get into the housing market, and then it literally leaves you home free, not paying anything except rates after that, despite the great benefits that you get from that, which are significantly contributed to by the public in one way or another. We need to reduce the barriers to entry and to moving house for the reasons that I've mentioned. Enabling moving house is very important and should no longer be seen as a sort of discretionary luxury, as it was perhaps legitimate to think of it as 20, 30 years ago. It's not the case now. Because of the needs for job mobility, moving house, and the complexity of households with more earners, it means we must facilitate moving house, and we must also facilitate downsizing by older people. So that's why I think it's very important to reduce or remove stamp duty on all purchases. That should be up to about the mid-price points. Not, I think, at the higher end. That's partly because there's a significant loss of revenue involved in this, and one has to be realistic about how much that can be carried. I want to emphasise, though, that it's on all purchases, because there's been a focus in the states that have done this on first home buyers. And for the reasons that I've mentioned, that's not the whole game. It's not just first home buyers we need to think about, it's job mobility and it's downsizing. So I would do it for everyone up to a certain level around the middle. We also, I think, should cap the age pension assets test exemption at about mid-price levels. That's mainly to encourage downsizing. And it's better to do anything there in relation to assets. To the extent that the means testing on the pension should be tightened, it should tend to focus on assets more than income. I think actually there's a case, frankly, for dropping the income test entirely on the age pension and funding the cost out of tightening the superannuation concessions. Because as many of you may know from your parents or grandparents, it's not only the income test, not only a deterrent to some part-time work or to some useful use of their capital, it's also an incentive to fiddle. Quite contrary to what I and many in the welfare sector thought 20 years ago, I, like most people, thought means testing the pension was a great idea. I'm very sceptical about it now, at least in relation to income. But it's a different situation in relation to assets. Well, then the other thing in relation to principal residences, and in my view the most important tax reform, and the thing that should absolutely dominate tax reform discussion, not the GST, which is frankly the lazy the lazy way of trying to achieve tax reform and doesn't provide any economic or social benefits. All it provides is revenue. And tax reform really should often be aimed at least as much on influencing economic and social behaviour, not just on getting revenue. The land tax exemption, which applies in all states, is nearly always, some exceptions, uncapped, so no principal residence has to pay it. I believe that that exemption should be removed for the sort of roughly above mid-price houses, because the land tax is a good way of getting a share of the benefits that the public has actually provided all homeowners from the surrounding environment that's generated by public spending and other things. It's also relatively easy because the valuations are already done for rates purposes. In fact, you could call this a rate supplement and allocate it to state governments or whatever. It's the same thing. Now, that was recommended in a sort of limited way because he'd been appointed by the Commonwealth Government, by Ken Henry, in his report on land tax. And you'll find that newspaper editorials, you'll find even last week in The Economist, it was strongly recommended. But unfortunately, the sort of front page media and the news media generally completely overlook it and keep going back to GST. But land tax is a much higher priority. And it's important also because, as Ken Henry also pointed out, in an international world, we really need to focus on taxing immobile assets which can't be taken overseas. Because competition between countries makes it harder and harder to tax financial activities and assets for fear of capital flight, so-called. So it's terribly important that we tax immobile assets properly. And so I think reducing the land tax exemption is a very, very high priority. I think fairly easily the most important priority for tax reform, not just in relation to housing, but everything else. But you do need to allow options to partially delay it for people who are asset rich and income poor. We could cap the capital gains tax exemption. A lot of people used to do that. That's, getting it at the end, at the point of sale. The advantage of that is that it's only the one hit, as it were, and it's when people are getting a lot of money, or quite a bit of money. So there might be less political resistance, and it would be easier to introduce because it's one government doing it, the Commonwealth, rather than each state. But it does deter sales, and it can also be very unfair in that if someone has to sell a house at a time when the market is relatively high, then they'll be paying perhaps excessive tax. And it distorts really people's behaviour in terms of when they sell, and can be haphazard in its impacts. Well, I'll move on then to rental properties, and we need there to reduce the inflation in house prices and private debt, limit the unfair advantages for investors over home buyers, and improve rental occupancy. At the moment, as a result of a change introduced by Peter Costello, of which he remains unfathomably proud, it's very clear that the surge in house prices happened almost to the day when the capital gains discount of 50% was brought in. It hugely increased the attractions of negative gearing and continues to do so. And again, Ken Henry recommended that it be reduced. I won't go into all the details. His proposal was moderately complex, but I think quite good, to reduce that discount, to have greater parity between capital gains and other income. It's bizarre, incidentally, that the more you've worked for your income, the more taxed you'll be. Labour income, work income, is taxed at the full marginal rate. If you speculate, it's taxed at half the marginal rate if you just sit back and play with some shares or whatever. If it's given to you by gift or death, you pay nothing. So, as I said, and one of the few times I've managed to persuade someone from the Centre for Independent Studies to agree with me, I said that people from that environment should firmly agree with what I'm saying about reform here, because they're meant to be in favour of, reward for effort, no freeloaders, no sense of entitlement. Well, our tax system on savings and on income is completely the wrong way around. So we need to change that. We also need to limit the deductibility of payments. That's at the heart of negative gearing, and incidentally is why we have now Until the last week, I used to say we had the third highest level of household debt in the world. We now have the highest. It's been like that for 20 years. The media focus almost entirely on government debt, which even now is very low. The problem is high household debt, private debt, the highest in the world. And that's a huge cause of future vulnerability, not just for individuals, but for the nation. And it's largely caused by negative gearing, and the negative gearing only works if you borrow. If you pay cash, it doesn't work because you're wanting to claim your interest payments. So it's a huge distortion, not only in house price inflation, but in debt inflation. And we need to limit the deductibility of interest payments, at least if there's not much rent being generated. And of course, in quite a lot of cases, there's no rent being generated. And as you probably know, a lot of these apartments are being deliberately left vacant to the extent that they can escape the very, very loose attempts of enforcement by the tax office to see whether they're genuinely available for rent. A very, very large number of apartments are vacant, deliberately vacant, because there's nothing in it for the investor. They're wanting the losses. Best to avoid any wear and tear on the apartment by actually allowing people into it. I'll skip the other aspect of that, but just come to the last one to do with rental properties, which is the National Rental Affordability Scheme. Now, I might say more about that if there are any questions about it in the interest of time, but it was a scheme, and I have to declare to some extent an interest because although the design of the scheme is not what we proposed, the Housing Summit Group that I chaired for quite a few years did propose a scheme which led to the adoption of this scheme. But this scheme, although it actually has worked reasonably well, contrary to what you'll read in at least one newspaper, it needs to focus much more on bringing institutional investors into the provision of affordable housing. Institutional investors, not the so-called mum and dad. And the way in which our scheme was changed by government when they brought it in totally moved away from that. It's got to be aimed at getting superannuation funds and others into the provision of affordable rental housing. And also, you can engage in what's called disaggregation. Land tax at the moment is based on the total value of all your properties. Now, that's a real deterrent to a few of the smaller investors. I recall someone from Melbourne wrote to me about this saying, look, I inherited a 12-apartment walk-up block of flats. I'd be very happy to let it out for affordable housing, but because of the aggregation of that for land tax purposes, I'm paying land tax on it. Now, if provided that I complied with requirements about affordable rental housing and who was in the housing, low to low middle income, how about allowing the units to be dealt with separately, which means they would all be exempt rather than bulking up, in which case they get over the threshold. So this sort of disaggregation has a lot to be said for it. In relation to transport, I won't say much there because I think that's pretty well known. Some efforts to reduce carbon emission and congestion, very important for people who are having to travel lengthy distances, but particularly, and there may be many of you who don't agree with me on this, we really need to reduce the scope for salary sacrificing and avoiding fringe benefits tax on vehicles. Fringe benefits taxes are wrought, and so is a lot of salary sacrificing. It's extraordinary that at a time when the intergenerational report was introduced, again with much trumpeting by Peter Costello, at the same time he and John Howard brought in a whole swathe of things which aggravated the cost of older people. Extraordinary, one of the biggest disjunctions I've ever seen between alleged policy priorities and actual policy adoption. And one of them was, tax-free after the age of 60, etc., and those sorts of things. Well, just finally, options for planning and investment. We need to set a long-term goal for increasing the share of national population living in medium-sized cities. We're a freak in international terms in the tiny proportion of our population that live in medium-sized cities, way below US, Canada, etc. If you add to that the problem in very heavy quotes, that our houses are low, cities are low density, we really need to encourage regional cities more. We've got the land, we need to provide the transport, etc. The internet makes it easier. The bigger cities have got well beyond economic and social efficiency. One of the indicators of that is the transport congestion, etc., and the house prices. But there are others as well, including the upward pressure on wages because of the high cost of living in those cities. So we need to, I think, as a major national goal, do that, and the appointment of the new Minister for Cities may help in that respect. We need targets for affordable housing in the National Affordable Housing Agreement, and we need major developments to have to provide a percentage. South Australia already requires a percentage of new developments must be affordable, with definitions of affordable. It's 15%. In the UK and the US, it's often 30, 40, 50%. And developers do it. Lendlease, for example, has said to me, we develop projects in the UK with 50% affordable housing requirements. We're not worried. We knew about it when we bought it. The price came down because of that, so we didn't have to pay as much. So we really need to move in that direction. I won't dwell on the others. Public investment in housing through the National Affordable Housing Agreement. Happy to come to that if there are any questions. And also public investment in transport, particularly rail. And of course there's some hope for that now with Malcolm Turnbull. Though I hope you won't think me too sceptical if I point out that because of his wealth, he's actually able to live. His electorate office is 50 metres from a train station, which is where he owns the whole building, which is 2 stations from Martin Place, which is about 200 metres from his office. So it ain't much of a surprise that he uses public transport quite a lot. That's too cynical, but just an observation in a sense about how life can be a hell of a lot easier for people who are in the inner cities and on railway lines and can pay the money to live there. And high-speed intercity rail. Why we dropped off on that in the past, I don't know. Again, it's the danger of following fashions. And Melbourne can be proud here because Melbourne hung on to trams when other people got rid of them, hung on to rail services. Other places, especially Sydney, tried to get rid of them. Rail was regarded as passé, and treasuries didn't like the long-term high investment approach, preferring more short-term things. Other countries have got a little bit more wise in these areas, and we need to too. We really need that more to help develop regional cities. All right, well, I must finish there.